Welcome back. I'm Elaine Reyes. We continue our special coverage of China's National Party Congress and Xi Jinping's new role as party leader. While the domestic front is key to most Chinese, the country is also taking a growing role on the world stage, both economically and in the world of global politics. For more on China's positions on the big issues facing the world, let's check in with Nathan King, who joins us live outside the United Nations headquarters in New York. Nathan.
Hi, Elaine. Obviously, this transition, a lot of people are asking questions about what Chinese foreign policy will be on the hot button issues here at the UN, including Syria. And the consensus is that the foreign policy won't change, especially when it comes to the Syrian crisis. They'll be based on the principles that China has, which is basically that UN member states have sovereignty, and there's also the policy of non-interference, hence China's stance on Syria. And while Beijing has played a central role in the shuttle diplomacy to bring about some sort of peaceful situation in this boiling crisis, there has been a reluctance to allow anything to go through the Security Council that could lead to outside intervention, hence the veto.
China holds an open attitude toward all constructive proposals that may help alleviate tensions in Syria and push forward a political solution. We will continue to play the role of a responsible major nation, together with the rest of the international community, to promote a political solution among all parties in Syria to achieve a ceasefire and the ending of violence. The Syrian government and the opposition should all keep their promises and take up their own responsibilities.
Other UN issues, of course, the peaceful rise of China and, of course, a greater responsibility in international affairs. I'm talking about a growing role that China's had in peacekeeping, especially in African countries, dialogue and, of course, reaction to emergency relief. But also, there's a growing role outside the United Nations of regional groups, and I'm talking here in particular of ASEAN. And China has said all along that it actually supports a growing role for ASEAN in Asian affairs.
China needs a peaceful, stable, and prosperous neighboring environment to pursue development. We hope to see a unified and strong ASEAN with dynamic growth, because this is also conducive to China's own strategic interests.
Yeah, but of course, you know, ASEAN's role has to be looked at through the prism of the recent United States announcement that they're going to pivot to Asia in the 21st century. And many analysts are saying that there could be some sort of competition between ASEAN membership when it comes to the United States in Asia and China as well. It's going to very much depend on the so-called dialogue partners in ASEAN. We're talking about, obviously, China, the US, Japan, Australia, India, and 5 others. And that really is going to be the focus of Chinese foreign policy in the next decade. Back to you, Elaine.
Okay, Nathan King reporting live from UN headquarters in New York. Thank you. For more perspective on the relationship between China and the rest of the world, let's send it back over to Mike.
All right, Elaine. Well, world leaders continue to congratulate China on the leadership changes. I recently had the chance to speak with John Huntsman, who has not only been a state governor in the United States and a Republican presidential candidate, but he's also been an ambassador to Singapore, then China. He says the United States wants to see China succeed.
The United States wants a strong and prosperous China. Why? Because we benefit and the whole world benefits from that. You have a stable region and a more prosperous region. The reality is, when you get to the heartland of China, when you get to the heartland of the United States, you talk to the soybean farmers in Iowa who are exporting more and more of their product to China. You talk to the alfalfa farmers in Utah who are exporting more and more to China. There's a reservoir of goodwill. And China is seen increasingly as an economic partner and as a market that will bring opportunity to the United States. So if we can hold on to that reality and to that, I think, emerging narrative, then I think we can begin to build a future around that would be good for both people.
Look in your crystal ball. Where do you see China 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
I see China in a better place. The people are too restive in China. They need an economy that delivers so that they can be productive on the world stage. I think they want their light to shine as a proud people. And in order to do that, you have to have an economy that supports that. And in order to have an economy that supports that, you're going to have to take a good look at the practices of state-owned enterprises, protection of intellectual property rights, marketing opening measures that are long overdue, and you're going to have to build up a middle class, not just be an export machine. So I think in 5 years, China is less of an export machine, investment-driven, and more of a consumption model, where you've got more innovation, you've got more local industry creation that's driven not by ideas that are taken from others, but homegrown ideas, and firms that are beginning to service and support a growing consumer class who, like never before, are going to want health care, they're going to want financial services, they're going to want to travel and tour the world, they're going to want to access new opportunities that they didn't have this last generation. And as an optimist, I think that opens up a whole new world of economic opportunities for the United States as China begins to rise and reform its economy.
One final question, because I know we're running out of time. Xi Jinping came here to the United States, had a chance to meet the President of the United States. The President isn't handcuffed by, I've got to run for re-election, I've got to play to a domestic audience. You have really kind of a break here in that sense. You've got the President moving forward in his second term. He's looking at a legacy. You have a new leader in China. How does that relationship come together? And what pointers might you give the President about developing and nurturing that relationship moving forward?
Take the opening. Take the opening, because the U.S.-China relationship goes in very distinct cycles. I can tell you that having lived those cycles, they're very real. There are either elections here, or there are leadership changes there. We have an opening now that is the first in a long while, and it's going to last, 2, maybe 4 years. And this opening should not be missed. It's for the President and for Xi Jinping to recognize that they've got an open door. No real political constraints that would disrupt the building of a solid relationship based on trust.
Interview I conducted in his home here in Washington, D.C. with former Ambassador John Huntsman. As he says, take the opening, the three key words, another three key words he mentioned, Gracie May Huntsman. She was born in China. He says he cares passionately about that country and this relationship went on, and he's hoping that this opening, that both these leaders will take the opening and move forward.
Thanks, Mike. Well, we are going to take a closer look now at China's investments around the world. The country's Commerce Department says China's outbound direct investment, or ODI, stood at nearly $75 billion in 2011. By value, that only accounts for just 4.4% of the global total. Still, China is now the world's 6th largest investing nation. Just 10 years ago, it invested only $2.7 billion outside the country. Last year, the single biggest recipient of Chinese investment, about a fifth of the total, was the United States. In the first 3 quarters of this year, Chinese companies invested $6.3 billion, a new record. But Asia remains the region that attracts the most Chinese investment, 71% in 2011. Latin America is a distant second at 13%. Now, let's look at Cuba's reaction to China's Party Congress. We go over now to our chief Latin America correspondent, Michael Voss. He's in Havana. Michael?
And Cubans have been watching events in Beijing with interest, because if there's one thing the Communist Party here has yet to work out is just who the next generation of leaders will be and how to engineer a smooth changeover while keeping the system intact.
Cuba's revolutionary leader Fidel Castro stepped down in 2006 due to ill health after almost half a century in power. The Cuban Communist Party Congress agreed last year that in future politicians should be limited to 2 5-year terms. But so far, no potential new leaders have emerged. One reason why Cubans were interested to see how it's done in Beijing.
It was another example of stability. There's been a substantial change in China's governing team in both the Communist Party and the state without any traumatic events. That isn't very easy in socialist countries, nor the history of the world.
Cubans are familiar with Xi Jinping. He visited the island last year. He also met President Raul Castro during his visit to China in July. where negotiations began on a 5-year plan for economic cooperation. Trade currently stands at about $2 billion a year. Cuba exports nickel, but the majority of trade is imports of Chinese manufactured goods, much of it on easy credit terms. At last week's International Trade Fair in Havana, there was a significant Chinese presence. Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean, and its population of 11 million people makes it an attractive market should the economy ever open up. A market which US companies can't compete in because of the trade embargo.
Cuba and China may both be part of the socialist camp and share similar political systems, but Anand, economically they remain far apart. Cuba is only now going through the first tentative moves towards economic reform that China went through 25 years ago. And for the moment, there are no signs that Cuba wants to embrace Chinese-style free market reforms.
Thanks, Michael. Michael Voss there talking to us from Havana. Now, the big trend between China and Latin America over the last 10 years has been trade growth. Now it's all about investment, and it's increasing. Stephen Gibbs joins us now from that powerhouse of the developing world, prominent member of the BRICS nations, Brazil. He's in Rio de Janeiro. Stephen.
You're absolutely right. I'd say that if chapter 1 of China's modern relationship with Latin America is one of trade, chapter 2 is proving to be investment. Just a few years ago, in 2009, there were a few $100 million of Chinese money being invested here. This year, we're set to receive 17 billion as the Chinese government and Chinese companies invest in the infrastructure here and really the hardware to extract and produce and transport the commodities that this region has and that China needs. And that is a popular move here, the move from just trade towards investment, because a lot of the countries here do have a fear of something that's called the resource curse, whereby countries in the good times, they sell their commodities at good prices, and then when that trade perhaps trails off, then they look at their countries and there's not much to show for it. So an interesting development as we move here from trade to investment.
Thanks, Stephen. Stephen Gibbs there talking to us from Rio de Janeiro. We want to get a different perspective now from Africa. China recently surpassed the United States as the continent's largest trading partner. The Financial Times reports that China has sent the equivalent of $15 billion to Africa over the past decade. CCTV Africa business anchor Rama Inyang explains how that money is being spent.
Infrastructure is a very, very large part of Chinese investment in Africa. Key case in point is the $365 million road project that we're standing on right now in the heart of Nairobi's capital. This, of course, is a thicker road project, and it's replicated right across Africa. You tend to see a lot of Chinese companies bidding for and building a lot of infrastructure projects, be they in road or rail. However, we're now seeing a diversification away from that. You'll see a lot more investment, for example, in telecommunications. Huawei operates, for example, in 25 countries across the African continent. They made about $3.4 billion in revenue in 2011 from Africa alone, and they expect that to grow by between 20 and 30% over the next 3 years. You're also seeing a lot more investment in real estate. We've seen that in Kenya, we've seen that in Angola, we've seen that in Rwanda, especially in the capital, Kigali, and the pattern of Chinese investment in Africa is diversifying, and we expect to see a lot more of that over the next 10 years.
Rama Inyang there talking to us from Nairobi. Now it's back to Elaine.
All right, thanks, Anand. Just ahead, some important changes to the party's charter. We'll examine what impact this will have on ordinary people. But first, we want to bring you more sound from the streets of China and what people are thinking about the future.
国内呢，我们要关键要处理好增长和通胀，还有就业这些关系，尤其是要处理好收入增长、民生要保障，还有我们的环境和保护要做得更好一点。
然后我希望新一届领导人能够制定的更多的政策，来提高像我们这种法律工作者啊，这种提高我们的一些就业的职位啊、能力啊，还有扩大一些这个市场。
希望一是呢，就在这方面就更多的开放一些 经济领域让民营企业参与进去，另外呢就让这个中小企业呢更灵活一些，给中小企业的支持力度更大一些。
Welcome back to our special Global Expectations. As we continue to look to the future, we want to take a moment to explain how the Chinese government itself is structured. For that, let's bring in Mike Walter.
Thank you, Elaine. To the outside world, China's political structure may be a bit confusing. There are several parties in China, but the Chinese Communist Party, or the CPC, is the ruling party. Inside the CPC, there are a lot of different elements at play. Here's a snapshot of the party that's ruled China since 1949. Let's start with the National Party Congress. It convenes every 5 years. It's made up of nearly 3,000 delegates, each of them elected from China's provinces and regions and various government departments. Its main function is to elect a central committee of about 200 full members and about 170 alternate members. That central committee meets annually and is in charge of electing a new Politburo and its standing committee. That small group is the highest body of the CPC. It meets regularly and discusses all of the key issues in the country. The Standing Committee also fills important posts, like the party's General Secretary. While the National Party Congress meets every 5 years to elect new party leaders, the National People's Congress meets every year. The body is considered China's parliament, which is in charge of approving the nominations of the premier and the ministers. Here, all potential legislation is open for consideration and approval. In addition, the People's Congress elects the country's president, vice president, and its own chairman. There are also party and MPC congresses in different provinces and regions, which meet to discuss matters of local importance. Because there are several parties in China, the CPC forms alliances with the other smaller parties. This forms the CPP-CC, the China People's Political Consultative Conference. It also meets every year. Now, one of the biggest concerns voiced by President Hu Jintao is corruption. There's a separate party organization with the sole purpose of tackling that problem. The Discipline Inspection Commission serves as a sort of watchdog on a national level, working to root out corruption or bad management.
All right.
Elaine, back
Thanks
over
a
to
lot. Thanks a lot, Mike. China revealed its new leadership yesterday. The new party leader, Xi Jinping, delivered a keynote speech in front of the global media. In his speech, Xi looked back at the party's achievements in leading the Chinese people to change their lives, and he also promised to lead the party to fight for the revival of China's national civilization.
Since its founding, the Communist Party of China has made great sacrifices and forged ahead against all odds. It has rallied and led the Chinese people in transforming the poor and backward old China into an increasingly prosperous and powerful new China, thus opening a completely new horizon for the great renewal of the Chinese nation. Our responsibility now is to rally and lead the entire party and the people of all ethnic groups in China in taking over the relay baton passed on to us by history, and in making continued efforts to achieve the great renewal of the Chinese nation. Make the Chinese nation stand rock firm in the family of nations and make even greater contribution to mankind.
During this year's Congress, the CPC also made amendments to the party's charter. But what does it all mean? Joining me now is CCTV's Wang Guan. There have been several major developments, so we are having you explain some of these major developments.
Right, Elaine. The key concept here is scientific outlook on development coined by former party chief Hu Jintao. What it really means is a set of theories and policies that aim to make the wealth distribution more equal and make economic development more sustainable. Well, we've got to understand that there is a political culture in China that loves to invent new political slogans. If you remember, they hope that politicians hope that somehow through mass media, these slogans can be picked up by the public, and so their political legacy can be long remembered when they leave office. This goes all the way back to the Mao era, if you remember the Mao Zedong thought, and then later it was the Deng Xiaoping theory that championed free market economy. That was enshrined, by the way, in the 14th Party Congress, and later there's something called 3 represents. Basically, it's a phrase coined by former party chief Jiang Zemin that opened our party rank to non-party members, such as college students, entrepreneurs, And that was enshrined in the party Congress 2 decades ago. And so this Congress is about Hu Jintao and his scientific outlook. Other amendments include tougher measures to crack down on corruption, meritocracy-based promotional system, as well as balancing the economic growth with, of course, protecting the environment.
So that is a long list, but for those who may not understand, it's meant to take place over a long period of time. So we shouldn't expect anything so soon.
Correct, right. Well, we have to bear in mind that any decision-making process in China, that comes incrementally. We don't come to see a great leap forward any longer. People have been talking about the fact that there's been a downsize of the Politburo Standing Committee from 9 to 7, and why is that happening now? Well, there has been a speculation that says basically the top leadership realized over the years that they want the decision-making process to be more decisive and to be more efficient. That's why they downsized the Politburo, and also that could have come in wake of a number of high-profile corruption scandals, especially the case with Bo Xilai, so that the party elders feel that they should curb on this factional competition for power, and so that's why we see a downsizing of the Politburo from 7 to 9. And we should also bear in mind that the size is not always fixed. Back in the 80s, it was 5, sometimes 6, and throughout the 90s, sometimes it was 7. Now it's back to 7 again.
We have a couple more minutes. Let's touch on corruption quickly. You just mentioned that because it was something that was said at the beginning of the Congress by Hu Jintao, and it was something that was also mentioned at the end by Xi Jinping.
Right. I think this is an issue that the Communist Party really have to tackle. If you listen to the speech made by Xi Jinping, the new party boss, yesterday, he spoke with a sense of urgency. He said that we show the responsibility of the people, that we've got to tackle this issue because it's so endemic, it's so entrenched. But people would also raise the question that how they're going to do this. Are they going to walk the talk? Because you've got to have an independent judiciary to crack down on this corruption issue, because if the party disciplinary inspection committee is composed of the party members, it might not be that effective. So independence of judiciary might be the way to go.
Okay, thank you, Wang Guan. Thank you for that report. We surely appreciate it. So as Xi Jinping takes over as the leader of the Communist Party of China, let's take a moment to think about all that has happened to get us here to this point. Mike Walter is back now with a look at China over the past century.
I'm shouldering quite a responsibility because I'm going to give you the whole timeline, which is extensive. We want to take a closer look at the Communist Party. It has grown and it has evolved over the years. It all began really in 1921. The party meets for the first time in Shanghai. Mao Zedong attends the meeting as a representative from Hunan. 3 years later, it joins with the Chinese Nationalist Party to form what is now called the first cooperation between the two parties. Let's move ahead just a bit. We'll head to 1935 now. The Red Army, led by the Communist Party, completes the well-known Long March to establish their base in Yan'an, in northern China's Shanxi province. Now, during the march, Mao becomes the party leader. Over the next 20 years, China sees several periods of violence, including the war against Japanese invaders and a civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The conflict will end in 1949. That's when the communists declare victory. They establish the People's Republic of China. Now, to 1958, China sees the Great Leap Forward, a social political movement. It failed. It caused food shortages and famine in China. Then we move ahead again to 1966 to 1976. This is the Cultural Revolution. It led to a massive purge of senior officials, caused chaos really across the country. Millions of people were persecuted in widespread violence. Historical relics and artifacts were destroyed. Cultural and religious sites were also ransacked. Another key milestone. U.S. President Richard Nixon visits China in 1972. His intent to normalize relations. He didn't know it at the time, but Mao Zedong was dying. He would die 4 years later. Now, we move ahead again. Deng Xiaoping rises to power, and China undergoes a series of economic reforms. In the late 1980s, China opens to foreign investment and to a market economy. Following some domestic turmoil in 1989, Jiang Zemin takes over soon after the Shanghai stock market will open. Then, in 1987, China regains control of Hong Kong from British rule. And then in 2000, the U.S. and China They establish normal trade relations, and soon after, China enters the World Trade Organization. In 2002, a new Politburo is formed. It's led by General Secretary Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao. Then, we jump ahead to 2012. Xi Jinping becomes the new party leader. What happens now? Only time will tell. But amid a sense of optimism and promise for the century ahead, it's clear China has weathered many storms and the country is looking ahead. Anand, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Now, Chinese investments continue to flourish in Europe. With more on this story, let's go to Jack Barton. He joins us live from Brussels. Jack?
Well, that's right. Chinese direct investment in Europe tripled last year, and some estimates predict that if it keeps growing at the current pace, investment into Europe could jump by as much as $500 billion by 2020. But of course, the euro area's economic troubles are showing no sign of abating, and many economists here are warning that fears of ongoing instability are beginning to override the temptation of any eurozone crisis bargain.
From Greece's largest container port to a French airline, Chinese direct investment in Europe is on the rise. Last year, Chinese investment tripled to $10 billion and is expected to soar dramatically over the coming years. But economists warn there are still a number of factors dampening the pace of investment from Chinese firms.
If you look at core countries, there very often the companies are loaded with cash, so I think there are no real victims for potential takeovers. There are prospects, but this fear of a Eurozone breakup has been still too strong for foreign investors, including Chinese investors, to massively get into southern European countries.
And despite the sweetener of a euro once again in retreat, those fears are unlikely to abate anytime soon.
The figures are in, and it's official. The Eurozone is in recession, while Greece remains in a full-blown depression. And of course, on top of this, unemployment for the bloc as a whole remains at a record high.
Which all adds up to exactly why rising trade and investment with China is increasingly considered critical to the bloc's economic health.
To what extent China has been a growth market for Europe is underestimated.
European officials and firms say they would like to see barriers lowered further in China for more direct investment from Europe. Trade tensions have been rising lately, but Europe has clearly ruled out reverting to protectionism when it comes to direct investment.
For the time being, no one is afraid of too much foreign investment. I think they are more afraid of too little foreign investments.
Investment that will no doubt accelerate if and when Europe can clearly demonstrate that the worst of its debt crisis is over.
Well, no one really knows when the worst of the debt crisis is going to be over, but that recovery is not expected to be just around the corner. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has caused quite a bit of controversy here in Europe over the past week by suggesting it will take at least 5 years for that to happen.
Jack Barton there reporting from Brussels. Now, back to Elaine.
Right, thanks, Anand. Over the past hour, we've gone in depth on the new leadership changes in China, what it means for the party, the country, and the world. We've shown you all the ways China is investing in other countries and continents. What we've seen is that with a leadership change comes an opportunity to strengthen ties and improve relations even more. Indeed, that is what Xi Jinping has demonstrated over the past year, not only traveling to different countries, but even inviting ordinary Americans to visit him in Beijing. President Hu Jintao has brought China further than some critics thought possible, and now the baton has passed. We close now with a look back at some of what we've heard in interviews over the past week.
This is the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. That if our two countries don't get along, I don't think the world has a hope for peace, prosperity going forward. So I think there is hope, but I think there's a need to bring the U.S.-China relationship back to normal.
I agree. I think there is a window of opportunity here.
And I think that Xi Jinping is the kind of leader, the fact that he came to Iowa to demonstrate his commitment to working with the United States. We obviously want to do all we can to improve the relations, continue to grow aid, and obviously there's been a lot of progress and change in China since I first went there in 1984.
Right upstairs, you'll find my daughter, who was born in China, Gracie May. So every day I have a reminder that our family is sort of a bridge between the United States and China. But I'm deeply committed to the relationship, not only because I've got great affection for the Chinese people and for the history and traditions of China, but I want to see this relationship succeed, because I know if we succeed, the world's going to be a much better place. It's going to be more peaceful, it's going to be more prosperous, and that will then rely on the goodwill of both sides to make that happen. It's totally doable.